but two distinct and broadly marked races, viz., the wanderers and the settlers, the vagabond and the citizen, the nomadic and the civilized tribes. Between these two extremes, however, ethnologists recognized immediate variety, partaking of the attributes of both. There is not only the race of hunters and manufacturers, those who live by shooting and fishing, and those who live by producing, but say they, there are also the herdsmen and of those who live by tending and feeding what they consume. Each of these classes has its peculiar and distinctive physical as well as moral characteristics. There are in mankind, says Dr. Pritchard, three principal varieties in the form of the head and other physical characters. Among the rudest tribes of men, the hunters and savage inhabitants of forests, dependent for their supply of food on the accidental produce of the soil and the chase, a form of head is prevalent which is mostly distinguished by the term prognathos, indicating a prolongation or extension forward of the jaws. A second shape of the head belongs principally to such races as wander with their herds and flocks over vast plains. These nations have broad lozenge-shaped faces owing to the great development of the cheekbones and pyramidal skulls. The most civilized races, on the other hand, those who live by the arts of cultivated life, have a shape of the head which differs from both of those above mentioned. The characteristic form of the skull among these nations may be termed oval or elliptical. These three forms of head, however, clearly admit of being reduced to two broadly marked varieties according as the bones of the face or of those of the skull are more highly developed. A greater relative development of the jaws and cheekbones, says the author of the Natural History of Man, indicates a more ample extension of the organs subservient to sensation and the animal faculties. Such a configuration is adapted to the wandering tribes. Whereas the greater relative development of the bones of the skull, indicating as it does a greater expansion of the brain, and consequently of the intellectual faculties, is especially adapted to the civilized races or settlers, who depend mainly on their knowledge of the powers, arid properties of things for the necessaries and comforts of life. Who depend mainly on their knowledge of the powers and properties of things for the necessaries and comforts of life. Moreover, it would appear that not only are all races divisible into wanderers and settlers, but that each civilized or settled tribe has generally some wandering horde intermingled with, and in a measure preying upon it. Whereas the greater relative development of the bones of the skull, indicating as it does a greater expansion of the brain and consequently of the intellectual faculties, is especially adapted to the civilized races or settlers, who depend mainly on their knowledge of the powers and properties of things for the necessaries and comforts of life. Moreover, it would appear that not only are all races divisible into wanderers and settlers, but that each civilized or settled tribe has generally some wandering horde intermingled with and in a measure preying upon it. According to Dr. Andrew Smith, who has recently made extensive observations in South Africa, almost every tribe of people who have submitted themselves to social laws, recognizing the rights of property and reciprocal social duties, and thus acquiring wealth and forming themselves into a respectable caste, are surrounded by hordes of vagabonds and outcasts from their community. Such are the Bushmen and Sonquas of the Hottentot race, the term Sonqua meaning literally pauper. But a similar condition in society produces similar results in regard to other races, and the Kafirs have their Bushmen as well as the Hottentots. These are called Fingos, a word signifying wanderers, beggars, or outcasts. The Lapis seem to have borne a somewhat similar relation to the Finns. That is to say, they appear to have been a wild and predatory tribe who sought the desert like the Arabian Bedouins, while the Finns cultivated the soil like the industrious Fellahs. But a phenomenon still more deserving of notice is the difference of speech between the Bushmen and the Hottentots. The people of some hordes, Dr. Andrew Smith assures us, vary their speech designedly and adopt new words with the intent of rendering their ideas unintelligible to all but the members of their own community. For this last custom a peculiar name exists which is called kuzikat. This is considered as greatly advantageous in assisting concealment of their designs. Here, then, we have a series of facts of the utmost social importance. There are two distinct races of men, viz., the wandering and the civilized tribes. To each of these tribes, a different form of head is peculiar, the wandering races being remarkable for development of the bones of the face, as the jaws, cheekbones, etc., and the civilized for development of those of the head. To each civilized tribe there is generally a wandering horde attached. Such wandering hordes have frequently a different language from the more civilized portion of the community, and that adopted with the intent of concealing their designs and exploits from them. It is curious that no one has as yet applied the above facts to the explanation of certain anomalies in this present state of society among ourselves. That we, like the Kafirs, Fellahs, and Finns, are surrounded by wandering hordes, the Sonquas and the Pingos of this country, paupers, beggars, and outcasts, possessing nothing but what they acquire by depredation from the industrious, provident, and civilized portion of the community. That the heads of these nomads are remarkable for the greater development of the jaws and cheekbones rather than those of the head, and that they have a secret language of their own, an English kuzikat, or slang as it is called, for the concealment of their designs. These are points of coincidence so striking that, when placed before the mind, make us marvel that the analogy should have remained thus long unnoticed. The resemblance, once discovered, however, becomes a great service in enabling us to use the moral characteristics of the nomad races of other countries as a means of comprehending the more readily those of the vagabonds and outcasts of our own. Let us, therefore, before entering upon the subject in hand, briefly run over the distinctive moral and intellectual features of the wandering tribes in general. The nomad, then, is distinguished from the civilized man by his repugnance to regular and continuous labor, by his want of providence in laying up a store for the future, by his inability to perceive consequences ever so slightly removed from immediate apprehension, by his passion for stupefying herbs and roots, and, when possible, for intoxicating fermented liquors, by his extraordinary powers of enduring privation, by his comparative insensibility to pain, by an immoderate love of gaming, frequently risking his own personal liberty upon a single east, by his love of libidinous dances, by the pleasure he experiences in witnessing the suffering of sentient creatures, by his delight in warfare and all perilous sport, by his desire for vengeance, by the looseness of his notions as to property, by the absence of chastity among his women, and his disregard of female honor, and lastly, by his vague sense of religion, his rude idea of a creator, and utter absence of all appreciation of the mercy of the divine spirit. Strange to say, despite its privations, its dangers, and its hardships, those who have once adopted the savage and wandering mode of life rarely abandon it. There are countless examples of white men adopting all the usages of the Indian hunter, but there is scarcely one example of the Indian hunter or trapper adopting the steady and regular habits of civilized life. Indeed, the various missionaries who have visited nomad races have found their labors utterly unavailing, so long as a wandering life continued, and have succeeded in bestowing the elements of civilization only to those compelled by circumstance to adopt a settled habitation. The nomadic races of England are of many distinct kinds, from the habitual vagrant, half beggar, half thief, sleeping in barns, tents, and casual wards, to the mechanic on tramp, obtaining his bed and supper from the trade societies in the different towns on his way to seek work. Between these two extremes there are several mediate varieties consisting of peddlers, showmen, harvestmen, and all that large class who live by either selling, showing, or doing something through the country. These are, so to speak, the rural nomads, not confining their wanderings to any one particular locality, but ranging often from one end of the land to the other. Besides these, there are the urban and suburban wanderers, or those who follow some itinerant occupation in and round about the large towns. Such are, in the metropolis, more particularly the pickpockets, the beggars, the prostitutes, the street sellers, the street performers, the cabmen, the coachmen, the watermen, the sailors, and such like. In each of these classes, according as they partake more or less of the purely vagabond, doing nothing whatsoever for their living, but moving from place to place, preying upon the earnings of the more industrious portion of the community. So will the attributes of the nomad tribes be found to be more or less marked in them. Whether it be that in the mere act of wandering there is a greater determination of blood to the surface of the body, and consequently a less quantity to the brain, the muscles being thus nourished at the expense of the mind, I leave physiologists to say. But certainly, be the physical cause what it may, we must all allow that in each of the classes above mentioned there is a greater development of the animal than of the intellectual or moral nature of man, and that they are all more or less distinguished for their high cheekbones and protruding jaws, for their use of a slang language, for their lax ideas of property, for their general improvidence, their repugnance to continuous labor, their disregard of female honor, their love of cruelty, their pugnacity, and their utter want of religion. Those who obtain their living in the streets of the metropolis are a very large and varied class. Indeed, the means resorted to in order to pick up a crust, as the people call it, in the public thoroughfares, and such in many instances it literally is, are so multifarious that the mind is long baffled in its attempts to reduce them to scientific order or classification. It would appear, however, that the street people may all be arranged under 6 distinct genera or kinds. There are severally 1. Street sellers, 2. Street buyers, 3. Street finders, 4. Street performers, artists, and showmen, 5. Street artisans or working peddlers, and 6. Street laborers. The first of these divisions, the street settlers, include many varieties, viz., the street sellers of fish, etc., wet, dry, and shellfish, and poultry, game, and cheese. The street sellers of vegetables, fruit, both green and dry, flowers, trees, shrubs, seeds, and roots, and green stuff, as watercresses, chickweed, and groundsel, and turf. The street sellers of eatables and drinkables, including the vendors of fried fish, hot eels, pickled whelks, sheep's trotters, ham sandwiches, peas soup, hot green peas, penny pies, plum duff, meat puddings, baked potatoes, spice cakes, muffins and crumpets, Chelsea buns, sweetmeats, brandy balls, in cough drops and cat and dog's meat. Such constitute and cat and dog's meat, such constituting the principal eatables sold in the street, while under the head of street drinkables may be specified tea and coffee, ginger beer, lemonade, hot wine, new milk from the cow, ass's milk, curds and whey, and occasionally water. The street sellers of stationery, literature, and the fine arts, among whom are comprised the flying stationers, or standing and running patterers, the long song sellers, the wall song sellers, or pinners up as they are technically termed, the ballad sellers, the vendors of playbills, second editions of newspapers, back numbers of periodicals and old books, almanacs, pocketbooks, memorandum books, notepaper, sealing wax, pens, pencils, stenographic cards, valentines, engravings, manuscript, music, images, and gelatin poetry cards. The street sellers of manufactured articles, which class comprises a large number of individuals, as a. the vendors of chemical articles of manufacture, viz., blacking, lucifers, corn salves, grease-removing compositions, plating balls, poison for rats, crackers, detonating balls, and cigar lights. B. the vendors of metal articles of manufacture, razors and penknives, tea trays, dog collars and key rings, hardware, bird cages, small coins, medals, jewelry, tinware, tools, card counters, red herring toasters, trivets, gridirons, and Dutch ovens. C. the vendors of china and stone articles of manufacture, as cups and saucers, jugs, vases, chimney ornaments, and stone fruit. D. the vendors of linen, cotton, and silken articles of manufacture, as sheeting, table covers, cotton, tapes and thread, boot and stay laces, haberdashery, pretended smuggled goods, shirt buttons, etc., etc. And E. the vendors of miscellaneous articles of manufacture, as cigars, pipes, and snuff boxes, spectacles, combs, lots, rhubarb, sponges, wash leather, paper hangings, dolls, Bristol toys, sawdust, and pin cushions. The street sellers of second-hand articles, of whom there are again 4 separate classes, as A. those who sell old metal articles, viz. old knives and forks, keys, tinware, tools, and marine stores generally. B. those who sell old linen articles, as old sheeting for towels. C. those who sell old glass and crockery, including bottles, old pans and pitchers, old looking glasses, etc. And D. those who sell old miscellaneous articles, as old shoes, old clothes, old saucepan lids, etc., etc. The street sellers of live animals, including the dealers in dogs, squirrels, birds, gold and silver fish, and tortoises. The street sellers of mineral productions and curiosities, as red and white sand, silver sand, coals, coke, salt, spar ornaments, and shells. These, so far as my experience goes, exhaust the whole class of street sellers, and they appear to constitute nearly 3/4 of the entire number of individuals obtaining a subsistence in the streets of London. The next class are the street buyers, under which denomination come the purchasers of The next class are the street buyers,